Hello Figure Fiends and Collectors, this is me, Daniel East 1000, back again with something a little bit different, something I've never really done before. Naturally I'm a little bit nervous about sharing this process, but hopefully we can learn together and maybe inspire some of you guys to give this a go. By all means, take any of my methods, approach with a grain of salt, and or naturally if there's anything that you think I could have done differently, i.e. better, then by all means pop that in the comments down below. It'll be very much appreciated. For I will be attempting to make a custom action figure, which is something I've always wanted to do. I've loved doing miniature painting, done a whole video series on that. If you haven't checked it out, it's well worth watching. But I've never truly made a custom action figure. I've always wanted to give it a go, but a lot of the kits online seem quite advanced and it's made me a little bit nervous to try them out. However, recently I've been playing Star Wars Hunters on the Switch. It's a fun little arena battle game I've been really enjoying, particularly playing as my favourite class, the Sentinel.
The Empire may have fallen, but there are still some Imperials out there fighting for the cause. Meet Sentinel!
The lone survivor of many Imperial regiments, this Stormtrooper is here to show the arena the Empire's might.
Time for an Imperial comeback. The Empire will always triumph.
This soldier's E-Web repeater is modified with a few extra additions, Lex.
Looks like Sentinel brought in some backup.
Reinforcements have arrived. I was built for this.
So I really wanted to make a custom action figure of this guy. Now, there are varying different skins that you can give this character, but to be kind to myself, and really I'm happy with just doing the Remnant Stormtrooper look, so it won't be anything too elaborate paint wise. So come with me on this journey.
Only on Hunters of the Outer Rim.
First and foremost, I need a base body to build upon. And while there's two Stormtrooper Black Series sculpts that are out on the market, one of which is an older one, and quite frankly not as good, but the other is more recent and is the superior sculpt. Fortunately enough, they've re-released this in the archive collection, so I've picked that up, granted at full RRP, of which I wouldn't really like to do for a custom build, ideally, but I really couldn't find any second hand. So this'll do. I'm really hoping it's just going to be a simple boil and pop situation with minimal Dremel and sanding, but we'll see. So that's the main body that we're using. The thing about Sentinel is he has an exposed arm, where his arm has gone missing and there's also a bit of tearing on the undersuit that he's wearing as well. So this really got my head scratching. I had a look at Marvel Legends figures, because mostly those figures have a lot of exposed arms. You don't really find many characters in Star Wars with exposed arms, particularly in Black Series, and I kind of got worried because if it's a boil and pop situation, which I'd really like to go down the avenue of as a starting build, then I didn't really know if Marvel Legends would have the joints that would maybe fit in place. So I then went back to my Star Wars Black Series shelves and I noticed the Dagobah Luke, of which also got repainted in a Heir to the Empire version, and that has an exposed arm, of which I could probably build on using green stuff to make the actual damaged material from the undersuit, and hopefully that should just be a case of boiling and popping the arm off, popping the forearm of the Stormtrooper onto the bicep, and the arm piece then fully into the body of the Stormtrooper. That's the ideal situation at the very least. So I picked up this Heir to the Empire Luke Skywalker, relatively cheap off of eBay. It was loose, and hopefully this is going to work out. If not, it may be a case of having to cut the arm and really hodgepodging it together to work on the Stormtrooper. There's a couple of options there, but the ideal situation is for it to be a boil and pop, but we'll find out as we go on into this build. But that's my main concern, really. And it's such a small, daft detail that really I could just leave out, but where's the fun in that? I want this to be fairly well representative of the character that you see in the game. Now, the thing that really makes Sentinel stand out is his big ass gun, his backpack, and of course the really battle damaged helmet. And fortunately enough, there is a 3D print out there available of those specific parts, and I got these from GI Trooper kits. Came very nicely packaged, I do have to say. And these printed elements are really, really nice. I really hope I can do these justice in terms of my paint job. It's mostly going to be a black spray primer. The only thing that will be white will be the helmet, and to be fair, the only bit of modification the helmet's going to need is just sticking a head in there, so dremeling just so it's going to fit inside snugly in there, so it'll have a joint that will stick onto the actual Stormtrooper's body. So yeah, everything else should be fairly straightforward to paint, he says. And I don't think there'll be too much gluing required, so that's kind of why I picked this one as my first foray into a custom action figure, just because there's minimal things to really do, he says. But in the eventuality if there is any sanding or cutting I need to do, I needed a tool because my toolkit is very limited, and I thought I needed to step it up a bit. There are all the components to actually build the figure, to actually assist in building the figure if needs be. I picked up this Dremel off of Amazon, relatively cheap, and it's quite compact, stores in this very nice case. I've got several different drill bits and things that I'll have fun trying out, and then we've got the actual Dremel itself, which is very, very, you know, it's got a nice grip to it, like a sonic screwdriver, I guess. But yeah, you can do various speeds with it. Ooh. And then you can slow it down. There's also a light. Don't know why you need a light. Yeah, just charges via USB, which I think is pretty nifty. Very nervous about using this. Hopefully I don't cut myself. But I'm looking forward to trying this out. I also picked up some green stuff, of which I stupidly don't have to hand, just to fill in any gaps if the case should occur that I need to sort of botch an arm. I think that's everything I need. I've got some paints. I'm pretty positive about this. I'm looking forward to this. I think I'm good to get started. So let's get started. I'm starting off by giving the Stormtrooper figure a little once over, comparing and checking to some of the 3D printed parts, and I think there's definitely going to need to be some dremeling required on that for it to fit in the 3D printed helmet. Just initially test fitting the shoulder pauldron as well, and I have a feeling we may need to just sand down some of the armour a little bit just to make this fit, so we'll come to that when we need to come to it. So the main thing that this build requires is some boiling and popping, so I get kettle on, pouring the hot contents into a bowl and giving the components that I'm going to be using a hot water bath. Letting them sit for about a minute, I remove them with a ladle. Ladle. That's a funny word. Dry them off a little bit, and then I can start popping off the parts that I need to, well, pop off. I'm not too sure of the actual science behind this, but the heat basically loosens and expands the plastic so that it becomes a bit more malleable. And well, you're able to pop joints apart as I'm doing here. Basically, once the figure cools down, it hardens and then everything should be in place. So I'm removing the components that I need. And I will note as well, I'm not getting rid of any components that I probably won't be using, because you never know, there might be a use for it at another point in time. So it's always good to save your cast-offs. I removed the shoulder pauldron from the Stormtrooper's arm, and well, the arm actually started to harden, so I gave it a quick little water bath again just to loosen up the plastic and pop the forearm off. I then tested this forearm with the Luke bicep. Unfortunately, the peg is way too big on the forearm that it won't fit into this. So this brought me to a bit of a crossroad to decide what to do next. I think the easiest way to rectify this is to dremel in that peg hole in the Luke bicep and maybe do any sanding or shortening down of that peg. So I went back and forth quite a few times with the Dremel to achieve this. It is very much a case of trial and error and a great deal of patience just to not overdo it. So I kept pausing and going back to it, just test fitting each time to see where we're at, until finally I was at a place where I was pretty happy with it. It's not perfect, but there's nothing to stop me going back in another time just to rectify a little bit more. The peg hole on the shoulder pad as well was way too small for the Luke bicep, so I decided to Dremel a hole for this, although that wasn't really necessary, as you'll find out. And well, I test fitted this into the actual arm socket, and again the peg on Luke was a little bit too big for the Stormtrooper Stormtrooper. So I did ultimately go back and sand this down a bit more, though I don't show it on camera. In order to make the ripped undersuit on the arm, I took some green stuff. This is a two-part compound that when you take equal parts and squish it all together until it becomes, well, green, you're then able to apply this and sculpt it in any which way you require. It's a very versatile material and you can pretty much paint straight onto this, once it's hardened of course. So I got to sculpting the tattered clothes underneath until I was at a point where I was happy with it. Naturally, I left this to set overnight so that it was ready for painting. I then put kettle on again, pouring this into a bowl and dunking the Stormtrooper helmet into this. This is so that I could try and remove the head that's been glued in there, and let me tell you, this was a real struggle to prise out. So much so I wasn't able to record. Now, because the head itself isn't going to fit in the 3D printed helmet, I then needed to Dremel this down. Once again, kept going back, test fitting, reshaving if it didn't fit, and so I got to a point where I was happy with it. In order to stick it down as well, I used some green stuff, and this also raised the helmet a little bit so it wouldn't catch onto the pauldron as much. And while I left this to set, and all that's really left now is to paint all the components that need to be painted. I started off with some Abaddon Black, painting over the forearm where I've applied the green stuff for the sleeve of the Stormtrooper. I then spray primed any elements that needed to be black using some enamel spray paint, rubberized black from Halfords, of which was relatively cheap. And naturally, I went to source material as to find inspiration on how I should paint the backpack and the E-Web cannon. And while there's no real fancy paint application here, relatively straightforward, so this left a lot of creative input on my side. And taking some Iron Warriors, I dry brushed a layer over this on both the E-Web cannon and the backpack, and then went in with a lighter metallic colour of Lead Belcher, dry brushing over these components again as well. Naturally, of course, when I've let the first layer dry. Then for the backpack, I picked out the areas that needed to be red using Mephiston Red. The backpack has this very cool glow on the sides of this colour, so I wanted to try and get that in. I then added a hint of white scar just because the canister within the backpack is coloured white, so that was pretty straightforward. Only a couple of details that needed to be picked out. For the shoulder pauldron, the modelling game actually uses grey for this, so I picked out the part of the shoulder pauldron that needed to be grey using Dawnstone Grey. Then moving on using Mornfang Brown, I painted up the pouches, and going back in with white scar, I painted up the insignia on the backpack strap. Then once this had dried, I went in with Runefang Steel and painted over this. Trying to be as sparing as possible just because I didn't want any of that detailing of the Imperial cog to be covered up. And while both these elements, the pouch and the strap, I shaded in Nuln Oil just to give it that grubby element, and this would also pick out the Imperial cog insignia quite well if I filled this in the recesses of that. While I let everything dry, I spray painted the helmet white, and honestly I didn't end up filming all the paints I used for the helmet, unfortunately. It was mostly Abaddon Black, going back in with white scar, using Runefang Steel for any metallic elements. I used a green, I used a blue, I used some greys just to pick out some of the details on the helmet. But yeah, there was a lot of back and forth on this, so sorry I can't show you the footage of the process of this, but finally applied some hard coat onto all the 3D printed components, as this acts as a really good sealant and removes some of the risk of paint chipping or rubbing, and also gives the elements a nice gloss finish, which helps matching up with the rest of the figure. It was then time to move on to the next and really final stage. I dabbed some glue into the holes of the backpack and glued the strap on. Oh yeah, and you know that shoulder pad I mentioned earlier? Wasn't really working out. It was just a little bit too thick for the arm peg, so I decided to completely shave where it attaches off and actually physically glue it onto the arm of the figure. I then also unfortunately off camera glued the shoulder pauldron on. I did end up shaving a little bit of the armour just to make the shoulder pads sit a little bit more flush onto the figure. I then also ended up gluing the pouches onto the Stormtrooper as well, then placing the backpack, of which fit really nicely onto the figure. I was somewhat expecting I may need to have glued this down to secure it, but luckily that wasn't the case, and it sits on the figure absolutely perfectly. Finally, I glued the pipe into the E-web, leaving the other end loose because the other end actually fit quite snugly into the backpack. So basically at this point, all that was left, pop the head onto the figure.
And now, here are today's combatants.
This ought to be good.
Overall, I'm super pleased with how this figure turned out. As my first custom, yes, there's a couple of issues with it, namely, I think the helmet. In terms of the coloration, works fine. I just think the whole body I should maybe have weathered as well, and I mean, there's nothing to stop me from doing that in the future. Yeah, it's just slightly off in person. That's just more so a me thing. It maybe could be just the fact that I know that that's a 3D print. It matches up okay, but I think if I weathered the figure as a whole, it would blend in a lot better. And I mean, Sentinel is a grubby boy anyway. Very battle hardened, very worn. So it is something I may do in the future. I did miss out some of the decal detailing because he should have some Imperial cogs just on that strap there, and also on the back of the helmet. I couldn't really find or work out if the ones that I was looking at online would match with this, if they would be the suitable size or too oversized. So I kind of left that detailing off, and it's not a major biggie, at least for my mileage. In terms of the assembly of the arm, I think I was pretty much there. The only thing is, there is a bit of gappage just where the forearm attaches. It's not fully as flush as I'd like, and likewise the actual arm itself, it does sit into the peg, but it does have a tendency to pop off a little bit. So again, I might need to sand down that peg. Again, very, very minor stuff, but it's stuff that I can learn from for next time. I'm really pleased actually with the spray primer that I picked for the blacks. That seems to be really durable actually, and took the paint really, really well. I haven't had any paint chipping so far, particularly on the gun, where, you know, the figure would naturally hold on to that, and that's where paint chipping would be really rife. But there seems to be no issue there at the moment, at the very least. But overall, I'm really pleased how this came together. It's built my confidence up slightly in terms of working on another project, but overall I'm really pleased with how this came out. Again, a lot of stuff here that I can do in due course. I know really I should just set this figure down and be happy with it, and to be fair, I'm happy to leave it as is, and particularly as this is my first custom, I'm really quite proud of it. But it will also serve as a reminder in terms of what I can do better. If there's anything that you noticed that I think I could do better, or if you've got any suggestions, I'm always open to that. Thank you so much for watching and tuning in. This is me, Daniel East 1000, sign out. Thank you very much for watching.